from the University of Bangor and Ben Goold from the Allied School of Law at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. Because it will take all the time if I get a biography for each of them, I'm going to spare them of those details and you. Suffice to say that they've all been working for a long time on various aspects of I say that, it's a good thing. on various aspects of covert policing, including doing some very interesting observational work. And they're all coming back because over an even longer period of time, they have histories as being members of this centre. So welcome back, the three of you, and I'm very much looking forward to this. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. We're really happy to be here. I'm Bethan. Our discussion today is based on an article that we published quite recently, a few months ago, in the Howard Journal of Crime and Justice. It was a state-of-the-art review article. And in that, we reflected upon existing research on covert policing to identify new areas of conceptual and methodological engagement in an attempt to better understand the harms that these kinds of secret police operations can generate. So the main thrust of our article was a call to scholars really to better account for and identify and understand the experiences of people who have been under surveillance and who have somehow found out that they were part of a covert policing operation. So we had two specific aims in that endeavour. First of all, we wanted to try and think anew about and identify and explore some of the hidden injuries and the personal harms, the broader harms to communities and the social fabric of covert policing and state surveillance generally. And another part of the article, the second major part of that piece, was to try to set out something of a roadmap for empirical research. So in other words, we wanted to engage directly with people who have come to know or it's been disclosed to them that they've been under surveillance by the police. So that was the overall thrust of what we tried to do in the article. Okay.
Try again.
Oh, there we go. So I'm sure all of you have an idea of what we mean by covert policing, but I do want to say just something about it. It's a key feature of late modern policing in the British context, as well as in other countries, and it generally involves methods like undercover police officers, UCs, civilian informants who begin and maintain relationships with people for the purposes of gathering intelligence or particular evidence. It also includes various kind of creative sting operations designed to lure potential criminals into particular crime contexts, and also obviously includes a bunch of technological surveillance as well, audio and visual devices, telephone tapping, that kind of thing. So as a kind of broad umbrella term, covert policing is largely understood to be police actions that are deliberately hidden from suspects and the broader public. But there are distinctions between what we would call undercover work, so obviously undercover police officers, let's say, or civilian informants will engage in face-to-face interactions and relationships with those that they are surveilling. Sometimes for very prolonged periods of time. I'm going to say something about the undercover policing inquiry in a moment, but we know that some of the undercover officers there were infiltrating movements for around 7 to 8 years, so we're talking quite long periods of undercover work. And as a mode of policing, Gary Marks quite a while ago talked about undercover policing being an active as opposed to a passive form of surveillance. So with the latter in mind, covert surveillance is generally understood as being kind of less up close. It's potentially much more passive. It's conducted remotely. So, for instance, think about sitting, which I've done as part of an ethnography. I spent quite a lot of time in surveillance vans with police watching people, but that was always at a distance. That level of deceptive relationship with the target wasn't quite there. So, I've moved forward. Too many laptops on the go. Both types of these methods are the focus of our paper. So we're talking about undercover work and the kind of less in-your-face covert surveillance. But what we're particularly interested in is how it's felt and how it's experienced. What does knowing that you've been under police surveillance do to you? What kind of harms can it generate? How might it derail or upset somehow your life chances, your relationships with people, and particularly those around you? So based on that, another point to make just briefly is that our discussion in the article has been very much prompted by an ongoing public inquiry into the kind of morally troubling practices of undercover officers. There's a public inquiry ongoing right now which looks at the work of officers in 2 secretive units, and some of the scandals that have arisen from that are obviously quite shocking and really bring to light some of the very real harms that... oh, sorry.
Oh. Do you want to take a picture?
Sorry, yeah. So the undercover policing inquiry, it garners lots of media attention. It's one of the most expensive and lengthy public inquiries to date. Some of the revelations at the heart of the inquiry is that undercover officers stole the identities of deceased babies to kind of build their legends, as it's called in the field, that they withheld evidence in court leading to miscarriages of justice, that they infiltrated justice campaigns, including spying on the parents of Stephen Lawrence at the time. Arguably at the heart of the inquiry, though, is the accusation that undercover officers formed intimate sexual relationships with many women who they were infiltrating in the protest movements. We know that at least 2 children have been fathered by officers working undercover, and the emotional and psychological fallout of that, not least to the women themselves, has really brought to attention, as I say, some of the harms and the major injuries that can arise as a result of this type of method. So for us then, I probably should say Ben and I previously have looked more at the covert policing side of things, so we've done ethnographic work with covert surveillance officers. So in a strange way, our thinking has been reoriented quite a lot in this respect as well. And as I say, it was the undercover policing inquiry which really prompted that. But really, the trauma, the confusion and the suffering at the centre of the inquiry has really brought to light not just the immediate effects of covert policing on somebody, but those enduring consequences as well. And what we argue in the article is that we really need to examine what we call the intimacy of covert policing and surveillance. So it's as a method, covert policing is deployed a lot to essentially the following crime context. So it's brought into play to explore serious and organised crime, so drugs, for example, suspect communities, those terrorism related, and also, as we know from the inquiry, it's also been quite ordinary to infiltrate protest groups and social movements. And it is true to say that in these crime contexts, if you like, a number of individuals will be placed under surveillance because there's perhaps robust intelligence or evidence that they are involved in serious criminal activities. And in many ways, we agree with Christopher Nathan here that some people, through their harmful actions, by committing certain crimes, make themselves what he calls morally liable to intrusions and manipulation by covert officers. So we tried to begin to think about, can there be a surveillance victim? What do we mean by victimhood within this context? So on the one hand, we can reasonably consider, let's say, the women at the heart of the inquiry as victims of state/policing harm. The actions of the undercover officers and the organisation that sanctioned those behaviours perpetrated a range of harms that devastated and derailed the lives of these women in particular. And at the same time, inevitably, some of the people who will be subject to covert policing will themselves be quite dangerous individuals who cause irreparable harm, and there is perhaps something inherently uncomfortable in calling them victims of surveillance. So whilst we were writing this article, we found ourselves in an ongoing tussle, sometimes heated debate about the idea of there being a victim within this surveillance context. And we don't still have the answer, I don't think, by any means, but one of the key questions that we raise within the article is, what does victimhood within this context look like? How far can victim be stretched to cover every person who is put under surveillance by the police? And I think I'm handing over to...
That one? Great,
Yeah.
Thank you very much. So thank you all for coming, and thank you for bearing with us as we move between ourselves as we give this presentation. It's a little unorthodox, but hopefully we'll manage to pull it off. I want to say a few things just by way of sort of introduction before I get into the sort of substance of the slides and the paper. One is, and I do this mindful that the editor is in the room, is to say it's actually wonderful to be able to write a piece like a state-of-the-art piece. There aren't that many journals that allow you to do that. And certainly not in 15,000 words. And I will say, I'll only speak for myself, but it was enormously freeing to be able to actually think about the sorts of things we're able to think in that piece and actually not have to work within some horribly restricted word limit. And then to also go through a peer review process and hear from one's colleagues. So I just want to say, I wish more journals did that. I think it's a really wonderful way to sort of surface issues that you wouldn't normally do in other sort of forum. The second thing to say is that this process for us, I think, again, I should maybe speak for myself, having worked in the area of surveillance for now, if I count my graduate time, over 30 years, it was a very good opportunity to reflect on the sort of path dependency of the things that you start doing and how it brings you to certain places. So most of my work certainly was on the policing side, looking at how surveillance was done. And insofar as it was sort of thinking about people, it was about how the processes of surveillance and the doing of surveillance affects police and police organisations. And so the subjects of surveillance, whilst I was interested in them, I didn't really try to think about them that hard. And so I think this conversation we've had and the process of jotting down the article has really forced a level of self-reflection. And I think it's been really wonderful in that sense. And also quite disarming, because you realise all the sort of assumptions you've made over the years that maybe you should have questioned a little bit more robustly. So I just want to say there's another piece in this, which is just an opportunity to sort of flip things around and think about them very differently. And this comes to the point that Bethan ended with about this notion of the victim. And it's something that I think, again, we have wonderful discussions amongst ourselves through the various drafts about this. And I remain uncertain as to my view on it. Every time we had a conversation, my view changed. Often it's just like a big pendulum swinging back and forth. And that continues to be the case. I presented this paper, or a version of it, a couple of weeks ago back in Vancouver, and got wonderful questions from the audience, and went away from that thinking, well, I've changed my view again, and I've got to present the paper here in 2 weeks, and probably it'll change again after this. So it's a very interesting process to go through. Anyway, that's all by the by. My part of this is to talk about surveillance and its encounters, by which we really wanted to sort of think about how we make sense of covert policing, and within that, covert methods, undercover policing, the sort of broader sense in which Bethan was talking about earlier, in the context of surveillance sort of studies, surveillance theory, where the scholarship has tended to be for the last 20, 25 years. And so we were keen to draw a contrast between mass surveillance, which a lot of us are very familiar with, things like CCTV surveillance would be a very obvious example in the United Kingdom, and covert surveillance, because there's a surprising lack of sort of writing about this. If you go to most of the work on surveillance, it tends to be about mass surveillance. It's obviously it's just very reductive, but one can talk about it as being obtrusive yet known, unobtrusive yet known. So you see the cameras, but they don't really interfere with you. You know you're being watched. You're aware of what's going on, but they don't really interfere with your lives in any meaningful way, at least for most people. And it's anonymous and depersonalised, by which I mean you're in a crowd. There's no real sense that it's necessarily looking at you. This would apply to things like data surveillance as well, but most of us assume that our activities online are being monitored in some way, probably recorded in some way, be it by the state or the private sector. And I'd hazard to say most of us feel okay about that because it doesn't feel like it's directed specifically at you. Right? They're not surveilling me, Ben Goold in particular, they're surveilling everybody who's buying something on Amazon, or everyone who's using a certain type of social media, or who is accessing some particular online service. And that's very different from covert surveillance, be it the sort of distantiated sort of electronic sort of covert surveillance, like listening in on phones or sitting in unmarked cars outside of houses with parabolic sort of listening devices and the like, but also undercover policing, which are both characterised by they're secretive. So the word kind of gives it away. It's covert. The subject does not know about it, not even in this sort of abstract. But it's precise, up close, and personal. So it's not about you as a member of the crowd. It's about you, right? The reason you're being put under surveillance is because something about you. And so they're surveilling me, Ben Goold, because they're interested in me, Ben Goold, not because I'm part of something larger. Although that, obviously, if there's an organisational component, that may be an element of it. And it tends to be, as Bethan's already alluded to, it tends to be long-lasting, it can be very intense, it can be very intimate. As a consequence, the sorts of information it gathers are very different. So the sorts of information that's given up when I walk through a public space and get picked up by CCTV cameras is very different from the sorts of information that covert police officers will get from listening to my phone calls or listening to my conversations in my house by way of listening devices. Now is it this one? Yeah. No, I won't do the other way. Sorry, it'll take us probably the end of the time to work this out. There you go. Okay. So, keeping that in mind, we also went back and sort of tried to think about how we make sense of surveillance systems in general. So, and this was against the background of realising in our conversations that most of the way we think about the impact of surveillance is through the lens of privacy. And privacy, for anyone who's looked at it, is a very amorphous concept. There are lots of different theories of privacy. There are lots of different privacy harms that one can think about. But typically when you look at the surveillance literature from the perspective of the surveilled, you start in a place of privacy, that something they wanted to keep secret has been made known, something they wanted to keep confidential has been shared, this is the sort of place where you start. And I think we felt that this was kind of, didn't capture anything like the sorts of harms that we were seeing in the undercover policing inquiry. It's just privacy. You could force things into privacy containers to try and make sense of it, but it really didn't feel right. And in fact, there are lots of things you wouldn't be able to reasonably fit into those spaces. And so we thought about this idea of thinking about surveillance systems in terms of how they can interrupt and shape one's feelings about the world and the social order, which is a very general way of thinking about this. But it does really, if you look at the sort of stuff that's coming out of the inquiry, it does really speak to this idea that it's not just about privacy. It's about one's relationships to others, one's relationships to the community and the state, but also one's sense of self, one's sense of identity. Because in a lot of cases, our identities are constructed in terms of the relationships we have with others. And when we discover those relationships are not what we thought they were, it sort of reflects back and we think, well, maybe we're not who we thought we were either. And so there's some really sort of quite significant implications for the notions of self. And so we tried to frame this in the article around this sort of contrast between mass general surveillance and covert surveillance in terms of you have to think about the nature of the intrusion, the power of the intruders, and the extent of the personal violation. In this case, we talk about dignity, bodily integrity, and the notion of relationships and trust. You have to think about them differently in these different contexts. But the way those things operate in the context of mass surveillance is very different from the way they operate in the sense of covert surveillance. And we really want to sort of ground that starting point because it takes you to very different places. So this is the sort of standard thing one often sees. Currently, very little research on X. This is often you see these in talks like this. And I'm often very skeptical about claims like that because, of course, you want to say that when you're about to say why people should pay attention to your work. But actually, it is surprising, having sort of immersed myself in this stuff for 2 decades, there is very little written about covert surveillance. And it's not for nothing we go back to Gary Marx's work. I think Marx's sort of the piece he's most famous for, I think was written in 1989, off the top of my head, but sometime in the sort of late 80s. And it continues to be one of the most cited works on undercover policing, even though it's now more than 3 decades old. And it's a very important piece of work, but you would think in the interim, other things would have come about. And he's continued to write, of course, but there's very little written about, very little empirical work done on covert surveillance in the UK, for obvious reasons in many respects. The police aren't enormously keen to let academic researchers look at that part of policing. We were very lucky. We did get the opportunity to do some ethnographic research, as Bethan has discussed, and we published a few pieces around that. But we're still very much the exception, not the rule. One piece we did come across and we thought was very helpful in terms of trying to reorient ourselves around the way you can think about covert policing was this piece by Stephen Scrifford. I've given the title and the reference for anyone who's interested in looking at it. But he looked at, he did some biographical interviews with 8 environmental activists who've been spied upon, who've been the subject of covert undercover surveillance. And I'm obviously paraphrasing a long and quite complicated piece into a number of bullet points. But he essentially found that there were 3 different aspects to the way in which people experienced this or responded to this sort of state surveillance. Firstly, activists described what he called a fractured reality upon learning that they had been surveilled, and this led to far-reaching implications for their sense of privacy and ability to trust people. Another way of putting this is once they discovered they'd been the subject of surveillance, their world looked very different. The something they had in the past that they thought were one thing was something entirely different, or a conversation they believed, an intimate conversation they believed was private, they now realise it never was. So obviously, one can imagine how that sort of shifts your sense of the reality around you. The second point was this: that the exposure to undercover officers had what he called a derailing effect. In that it pushed people away from the activities they're engaged in. Again, not entirely unexpected. If you've been subjected to this sort of surveillance consequential activities, and then you find out, it's not surprising, you might retreat from them in an effort to try and reclaim some sense of privacy and sense of self, for example. And then thirdly, he had this point about that in other cases, people developed a real resilience. They actually, coming out of this, moved into what he described as anti-state surveillance activity. I think that's actually the wording, right remembering?
Yeah.
And again, that's also an act, you might imagine people are very unhappy to discover this, and that may translate itself into sort of not a particularly positive view of the state going forward. So all of this is to say this sort of grounding for us, the sort of reimagining of the sort of theoretical way you think about covert surveillance led us to a couple of ideas that sort of animate the whole article, I think it'd be fair to say, which is to move away from a sort of notion of privacy as your starting point. Again, because there's a path determinacy. Where you start tends to determine where you go next and often where you end. And so we wanted to expand that foundation. And as we put it here, to expand our framework of harm to include, as we put it, the myriad ways in which covert surveillance can damage, amongst other things, the individual's sense of self, their ability to form and maintain relations with others, and their trust in the police and the state. So these sort of axes of thinking about and orienting harms. And I should say there are privacy theories that in their own ways can accommodate all of these things and profess to do so. But I think we felt that pulling them apart and giving them their own space allows you to think about them in a much different way rather than try to compress them into some account of something else. And I think, and so this is my last 2 slides, and I'll hand over to Martina. So this shifting the focus away from privacy to broader conceptual harm, and the word I haven't mentioned here is dignitary interest. We're also very interested just in the idea of how this affects one's dignity. And we touch on it, dignity is a huge concept in terms of in all sorts of spheres, but it's one that we felt really doesn't get captured enough in this context. But so the questions we had at this sort of midpoint in the article were, can existing accounts of privacy capture unique dignitary harms that can arise from being under surveillance? So it might not be that what they're capturing is secret, but knowing somebody else knows it may really affect one's sense of dignity. And that's something that you don't see captured very often, or at least not talked about. Do we need to distinguish between different types of surveillance subjects based on their degree of exposure, the extent and nature of their alleged criminality? This goes back to the victim piece earlier, or the illegality of the police surveillance itself. Does it matter? How much does it matter if the surveillance was lawful or not, in terms of the experience of the people involved? And finally, the last two, does it matter when and whether a subject becomes aware that they have been a target of undercover police work or covert surveillance? Which is a really interesting question. And there's stuff in criminal law theory that talks a lot about this, that if you don't know someone's interfered with your bodily integrity because you're asleep, for example, have you actually been assaulted? Right? And there's really interesting, and my view is yes, absolutely yes. But it raises some interesting questions about the nature of the harm involved. Right? That's the real nub of the issue. And so we want to try and capture that. For example, if should there be a legal obligation for people who've been the subject of covert surveillance to be told about it at some point after the surveillance has been discontinued? For example, they've been under surveillance for 6 months, the operation has ended, no charges have been laid, there's no suggestion they actually have committed any criminal acts. Should they be told about that? And what would that mean, and how would it be done, and what might be the implications? And then this question, to what extent should any account of the harms arising out of this sort of surveillance encompass notions of secondary victimisation and the ongoing effects of trauma? And that's a very short bullet point, but there's huge implications in terms of thinking about secondary victimisation, obviously, but also I'd say there's a very limited account in any of the surveillance literature, in my view, about notions of trauma. And I do think it's one of the things that we've started to think more carefully about is the notion of trauma in relation to harms in the criminal justice system and more broadly. And so, for want of a better phrase, how do we have a sort of more trauma-informed understanding of the implications of this sort of police work? And I think that was one of the key sort of features of the piece. And that's my last slide, so I'll hand over to Martina.
Thank you. Can you hear me from here? Give me another. Yeah? Be happy? Okay, so what we did in order to try and answer some of those questions was to go a little bit further afield. So we've established that there isn't much work on the harms that are caused by undercover policing in the UK context. But of course, we do have examples of quite expansive undercover surveillance practices in other countries. I should preface that by saying that obviously these are very specific examples, right? So we're not saying that they translate, but they still illustrate what the harms are and who has empirically tested what these harms might be. When individuals find out or are aware of that they are the subjects of very extensive state interference and state surveillance. So we looked at 2 case examples. We looked at state-sponsored surveillance in an authoritarian regime. We looked at the GDR because after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the German government decided that it was really important to illuminate to people what happened under the German Democratic Republic's surveillance regimes. So they opened the Stasi, the secret police, archives for people to see, to find their names, to find out where they're under surveillance, what did that look like, and what happened, right? So there was a huge amount of people went to the files, looked at the archive, and found out who'd been looking at them, who'd surveyed them. Now, as I said, this is very specific, it's a very specific example, but actually you find examples of this in a lot of Eastern European states, and the ramifications of those are long running. So it also speaks to the question that Ben raised around should people know. So in Germany, you have a right, you have the obligation to be told that you have been under surveillance, regardless of whether that surveillance practice is actually used in court or not. So you get a timeline by which you have to be told that you've been under surveillance by the state police. And that is in part a reflection on those experiences. So we looked at what was said, what research came out of the work. So German researchers had spoken to people who found that they'd been under surveillance, talked to them what it meant to them to find out that their friends had spied on them, that the police had spied on them, that the Secret Service had spied on them. Again, the context is important. This is a web of surveillance. This is not just one aspect of the state. And you can see there that there was quite extensive evidence of the impact, really, really personal violation of the self, right? People talking about suicide and self-harm, talking about feelings of betrayal and self-doubt. Who am I? What's happened to me? Can I trust any relationships I've had? They talk about a creation of an unstable sense of self and security and anxiety for the future. An incessant distrust of others. Now, this is really important in the context of what we're seeing unfolding in some countries. We've got German elections coming up. In terms of the longer term impact some of these things can have when you have a distrust of the state, but also a distrust of others in your society, right? These kind of implications are quite deep running. I should have said we're borrowing quite a lot in this paper from other scholarships. If we look at parts of political theory, look a little bit of penology, some of these concepts translate quite easily, others are a bit clunkier, so bear with us. So people start dissecting their past interactions. Can I, spoke to that person and they ratted me out? But how does that make you feel? They start rigorously self-policing, right? So it has a real impact on how you behave in the future. You kind of keep more things private. You don't talk. You don't let people know what's going on in your life because you don't know who you can trust. And that fear of the state as an overbearing entity that significantly restricts your life chances then. So real, deep felt harm, right? And Verdery talks about her own experiences of being the subject of surveillance, and she talks about the fact that there's nothing like reading your secret police file to make you wonder who you are, right? What persona speaks back to you, and what does that say about you, how others perceive you, how others read you. So a very specific case, of course, and then we have another very specific case, which is the state-sponsored surveillance in political conflict. So Northern Ireland, another example where we've got quite good empirical evidence on the impact of surveillance of sectarian groups, talking about the experiences of knowing that the British state was trying to find out what they were up to, right? And again, this talks about this issue of victimhood. Can we talk about those who might have wanted to harm others, commit terrorist acts as victims? Regardless of what we think about this, they are experiencing harm as a result of this. They are experiencing consequences. So Garrity talks about this kind of invisible cage of electronic and human surveillance, Orwellian in its implications for a liberal society. So a felt cage that you live in. And there's further work around the enduring effects of the use of covert civilian informers to the police and intelligence agencies. So this atmosphere of mistrust, again, coming through very strongly. It dominates your relationships with others, not just the police and the state. A habit of self-censorship. So again, implications for the future, not just the past, and not just past harm, but future harms. And this idea that people retreat deeper into their private selves and their private lives, right? Retreating from the public domain, not saying what you think. So we tried and think about what that means. So what is the impact of surveillance from these examples? And you can see that they're not short-lived, they're long-lasting. They're longitudinal in terms of individuals, their communities and wider society. So the reason I refer to the German election is that when you look at levels of trust in the state and trust in others, in Eastern European countries in particular, there's a European survey that looks at these kind of questions, you see a marked difference between Western European societies who've escaped authoritarian regimes for a longer period of time and those who've been longer under authoritarian regimes and express that heartfelt distrust. So this is longitudinal impact. It has chilling effects. People don't want to say what they think, or they only say it to the ones that they most trust. So it has an impact on democracy, right? How much we can actually oppose views, how free we feel to do so. Creates this mistrust of the state and others, and a fear of the state. So the question then, comes back to this issue of, is there a need and a desire disclosure, does it do more harm than good if you find out that you've been a victim of state surveillance? What does it do to you? How many people know already and suspect? So in Northern Ireland, in contrast to, although in the GDR most people also were aware that there was quite significant surveillance going on, but in Northern Ireland the groups were absolutely aware that there was an attempt to find out about them. So it wasn't a surprise, the extent maybe was a surprise. And it kind of re-emphasizes that point around the human-centered approach to surveillance, you know, a bottom-up approach to the lived experience. What does it mean? Now, as I said, this is very specific, and we try to pull out some dimensions of the surveillance. And we borrowed this concept from Ben Crew, who talked about it in the context of prisons, around the kind of the tightness of the surveillance regime. And there are a number of additional points that we want to make. So when you think about how much harm is done, there is that question of how deep was the surveillance, how intensive, how intrusive was it? Were they just monitoring your communications, or did they put a bug in your home and actually listen to you over dinner, or, you know, in other aspects of your life? How intrusive? How weighty? So how extensive was it? How long? How many aspects of your life? Was it informers as well as just the police car sitting outside your car? And with that, how tight did the surveillance regime become? You can have surveillance that is one-off stings, right? We want to find out whether X has murdered their partner. We have a suspicion. We put them under surveillance until they tell us that they have. That takes a week, and then it's over. That's different from, you know, the kind of regimes of surveillance that we've described. And then two more points around the expectation. So we talked about this notion of the criminal, right? You can think of the worst criminal you want to think of. Let's talk about an organized crime boss. Do they have a kind of, you know, it's part of my work life that I will be under surveillance by the police? Do I have to expect that? Do I make myself morally liable? And therefore, is it kind of legitimate in my eyes that the police are doing this? Does that make a difference? Does it not? Maybe the impact is the same. People talk about the paranoia that those who are in organised crime live under. Is that an impact of the surveillance, or just, you know, as I said, part of the job kind of thing? And we also look a little bit on the impact on the police officers who are involved in this as moral agents, but it is a kind of a side venture as part of this. And finally, for the kind of the theoretical elements, we do try and consider how this feeds into discussions of the pains of policing. When we talk about the pains of policing, the injustices, the failings, the differential treatment that is experienced at the hands of the police, we often talk about over-policing. We don't talk about covert policing because we don't know. There is no list. There are no statistics on ethnicity or gender. We don't have these things. So how can we talk about the pains of policing? Do we need to consider this as well? And do we, from the limited research that we do have, believe that actually the pains of the covert policing will, again, fall disproportionately on certain groups in society? And what does that mean? I think part of the response to the undercover policing inquiry was that a lot of people surveyed just didn't expect that they would ever be subjects of British policing, right? You know, middle class people being activists, you know, doing something great for the environment. They didn't expect that the police would come after them. That's just not the expectation. So does that impact? And does is that actually abnormal in the kind of the context of covert policing? Do we see covert policing much more in where we expect it to be, in marginalised communities, suspect communities, those kind of areas? Final point on this is the relationship between covert policing and overt policing. Part of the discussion is often, oh yeah, covert policing will lead to overt policing, right? They find it data and information to bring a case to court. That's sometimes the case, but not always. Some of the activities is purely disruptive. It's about letting the organised crime group know that we're watching you, and therefore trying to get them on the edge and trying to disrupt their activities. What is that relationship between covert and overt policing, and can we find out a little bit more about this? And here we go. And back to Bethan. I'll press something else. Oh. Sorry.
Try again.
Yeah. So roughly the first half of the article was around looking at various parallel literatures. You know, as we say, we explored GDR literature, loads of different, you know, authoritarian regimes and the kind of the legacy of the surveillance that they committed. We tried to test some existing concepts like the pains of policing framework, and we also, you know, came up with a couple of concepts of our own as well. But it's notwithstanding this kind of conceptual and theoretical engagement that we went into the article. We felt very, very strongly that what we need to do is actually reach out to the surveilled, do some empirical research with them, which obviously is much easier said than done. Covert policing, we know, is notoriously difficult and a challenging topic to study. Accessing people who, for some reason, have found out that they've been under surveillance is incredibly difficult too. Not least because the vast majority of people who have been watched by the police will just never know that they've been watched. But we do know from the undercover inquiry that there are certain circumstances in which people have found out that they were interfered with by an undercover agent, that they were watched, that they had bugs in their homes, that they were followed, around society. And for those reasons, we think, whilst challenging, it's doable. And so